There is a moment in life that arrives quietly, without announcement, without warning, yet it fractures everything you believed about existence. It is the realization that no one is coming. Not the person you imagined would understand you, not the mentor you thought would notice your struggle, not the system you trusted to reward effort, not time itself as some mystical healer that eventually corrects imbalance. At first, the mind rejects it. It fights the idea, searches for exceptions, constructs invisible lifelines to preserve comfort. But beneath all resistance, the truth remains unchanged and unmoved. You are standing in a world where every voice you expected to arrive has already gone silent, and what remains is the echo of your own expectations collapsing inward. This is not dramatic despair, it is structural reality. The collapse feels emotional only because illusion always dies painfully. What actually breaks is not your life, but the fantasy that life had a rescue mechanism embedded within it. And when that fantasy dies, something unsettling happens. The world does not respond. It continues as if nothing has changed. That indifference is the first real encounter with truth. It is here, in this silence, that the mind begins to understand that waiting was never a phase, it was a form of unconscious surrender disguised as patience. Human beings are not naturally built for this realization. From the earliest stages of awareness, the mind is trained to expect response, to anticipate presence, to assume that signals sent into the world will eventually be answered by something external. Society reinforces this at every layer. You are taught that effort attracts reward, that pain attracts sympathy, that confusion attracts guidance, that if you remain visible enough, someone or something will eventually intervene. Stories, education, relationships, even cultural narratives are structured around the idea that isolation is temporary and rescue is inevitable. This conditioning runs so deep that it becomes invisible, like air you do not notice until it is gone. So when life fails to deliver the expected response, the mind does not interpret it as absence of rescue, but as delay. It creates explanations instead of confronting emptiness. This is why people can remain stuck for years in cycles of waiting without ever questioning the foundation of that waiting. The belief in rescue is not just emotional, it is structural conditioning embedded into perception itself. And breaking it does not feel like learning something new, it feels like losing something essential, because it removes the illusion that responsibility can be outsourced to anything beyond yourself. The cost of waiting is rarely visible in the moment it is paid. It accumulates silently, like erosion rather than explosion. Days pass in partial effort, decisions are postponed under the assumption of better timing, risks are avoided under the assumption of better conditions, and internal potential is negotiated away in exchange for temporary comfort. What looks like patience from the inside is often avoidance wearing a rational mask. Meanwhile, life continues to move forward without permission. Opportunities do not pause for hesitation, and time does not return to compensate for uncertainty. The most severe damage is not always external loss but internal stagnation, where the mind becomes trained to rehearse action instead of performing it. Over time, identity begins to form around delay itself. A person no longer sees themselves as someone preparing for life, but someone perpetually waiting to begin it. This creates a quiet fracture between intention and reality, where the imagination remains active but execution becomes rare. The longer this gap persists, the more natural it feels, until inaction stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like personality. And in that state, even awareness of wasted time becomes powerless, because awareness alone cannot replace momentum that was never built. At some point, the illusion of shared ownership over life dissolves, and what remains is uncomfortable clarity. Every consequence you experience is tied to a decision you made, allowed, or avoided. This does not mean external forces do not exist, but it reveals something more fundamental, that no force outside you carries final responsibility for your direction. People can influence, systems can constrain, circumstances can pressure, but none of these entities hold your internal steering wheel. The weight of this realization is not moral, it is mechanical. It simply describes how reality functions when examined without emotional negotiation. Every path taken or abandoned eventually returns to the same origin point of accountability. Even reliance on others is still a decision you actively sustain, not something that happens independently of you. This is where many resist the truth, because ownership removes the comfort of diffusion. It eliminates the ability to distribute blame across environment, timing, or others' actions. But it also removes illusionary dependency, revealing that control was never absent, only unclaimed. Once seen clearly, there is no return to unconscious delegation of your life's direction. You may still seek help, still collaborate, still learn from others, but the authorship of outcomes can no longer be convincingly placed elsewhere. When the expectation of rescue finally dissolves, what emerges is not immediate strength, but raw exposure. You are left alone with the structure of your own decisions, without external interpretation to soften them. This is the beginning of genuine responsibility, not as burden, but as recognition. It is the moment where life stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that responds to you. In this state, excuses lose their structural support, because there is no longer an imagined future figure who will validate inaction or correct outcomes. What replaces waiting is awareness, and awareness begins to reconfigure behavior at its root. Small decisions begin to carry visible weight again. Effort stops being symbolic and becomes directional. Even discomfort starts to feel informative rather than oppressive, because it is no longer interpreted through the lens of rescue or abandonment. It is simply feedback from reality. This shift does not make life easier, but it makes it honest. And in honesty, something subtle but irreversible occurs. The individual stops searching for permission to move forward. Not because confidence has fully formed, but because the idea of waiting for someone else to initiate life no longer holds meaning. The human mind is built around a quiet assumption that is rarely questioned because it feels too natural to examine directly. From early awareness, there is an embedded expectation that distress will eventually attract relief, that confusion will eventually meet clarity from outside, and that struggle will be met by intervention from something greater, wiser, or more capable than the self. This expectation is not born from logic but from repetition. It is reinforced in childhood when help arrives before full understanding of consequence, in stories where heroes appear at the last moment, in cultural narratives where suffering is followed by rescue, and in social structures that suggest stability is distributed rather than individually constructed. Over time, this forms an invisible architecture of belief, that life contains hidden mechanisms of salvation waiting to activate when conditions reach sufficient intensity. The illusion is subtle because it does not present itself as certainty, but as probability. It whispers that if effort is maintained long enough, if patience is extended far enough, if endurance is stretched to its limit, something external will eventually respond. This creates a psychological posture of waiting disguised as endurance. The individual does not perceive themselves as passive, because waiting feels active when paired with emotional tension. Yet beneath that surface activity lies a dependency on outcomes that are not controlled internally. The illusion of rescue becomes most powerful when uncertainty increases, because uncertainty is misinterpreted as a signal that intervention is approaching. In reality, uncertainty is neutral, but the conditioned mind translates it into expectation. Thus, the belief in rescue survives not through evidence, but through interpretation. It becomes a lens through which all difficulty is viewed, turning silence into promise and absence into delay. The illusion does not remain confined to abstract belief, it extends itself into every domain where human attachment exists. It takes shape in relationships where emotional dependence disguises itself as connection, in systems where authority is mistaken for protection, and in the idea of destiny where randomness is rebranded as design. People begin to distribute responsibility for their lives across external anchors, believing that stability will be delivered through proximity to others, through institutional structure, or through invisible forces that are assumed to be guiding outcomes. Relationships become overburdened with expectations that no human can sustain, as individuals quietly assign them the role of emotional rescue. Systems are treated as parental figures, expected to correct imbalance, reward fairness, and absorb uncertainty. Even destiny becomes a psychological refuge, offering comfort in the belief that outcomes are pre-written and therefore not fully dependent on personal action. This diffusion of responsibility creates a fragmented sense of agency, where the individual feels partially involved but not fully accountable. The mind learns to interpret support as salvation rather than cooperation, and guidance as replacement rather than assistance. In this structure, external forces are elevated beyond their actual function, while internal capacity is gradually undervalued. The more a person relies on these external constructs, the less they observe their own role in shaping direction. Over time, dependence becomes invisible because it is normalized through repetition. What begins as trust slowly transforms into delegation of control. The illusion persists because it offers psychological relief. If outcomes are governed elsewhere, then personal failure can always be attributed to external failure. This preserves emotional comfort but erodes the foundation of self-directed action. False hope is rarely recognized as a form of avoidance because it is wrapped in emotional comfort. It allows the mind to remain calm while still avoiding confrontation with immediate action. Instead of forcing direct engagement with reality, the individual learns to substitute intention for movement, imagining future resolution as a way to soften present discomfort. This creates a psychological buffer where urgency is continuously postponed without being consciously rejected. The mind tells itself that conditions are not yet right, that timing must align, that clarity must first arrive externally before action becomes valid. These narratives reduce internal pressure while preserving the appearance of forward orientation. Hope, in this distorted form, becomes a mechanism for emotional regulation rather than a catalyst for behavior. It soothes uncertainty without resolving it, and in doing so, it replaces execution with anticipation. The longer this pattern persists, the more the nervous system associates inaction with safety and action with exposure. This inversion is subtle but powerful, because it trains the individual to experience movement as risk and waiting as protection. Over time, imagined futures begin to feel more accessible than present decisions, even though only present decisions carry real consequence. The illusion is sustained by intermittent reinforcement, where occasional external changes are interpreted as confirmation that waiting was justified. A small shift in circumstance becomes evidence that patience is working, reinforcing the cycle. Meanwhile, the actual distance between intention and execution continues to widen. False hope does not collapse under pressure, it adapts by redefining delay as preparation. It transforms stagnation into a narrative of readiness, convincing the individual that they are still progressing internally while externally nothing changes. The consequences of waiting are not always immediate, but they accumulate with precision over time, shaping outcomes in ways that often go unnoticed until they become irreversible. Stagnation does not announce itself loudly, it appears as repetition without progress, as cycles that feel familiar but never advance. Each postponed decision creates a parallel version of reality that never materializes, while the actual timeline continues without adjustment. Over time, this produces a pattern where effort is repeatedly initiated but rarely completed, leading to fragmented experience rather than coherent development. Opportunities are not always lost in dramatic moments of refusal, they are often dissolved through delay, through hesitation that outlives its justification. The mind begins to normalize partial engagement, where starting becomes a substitute for finishing, and thinking becomes a substitute for doing. This creates a loop in which temporary motivation replaces sustained discipline, and each return of energy feels like a fresh beginning rather than continuation of unresolved action. Failure, in this structure, is rarely singular, it becomes cyclical, because the same internal conditions produce similar external outcomes. Without intervention, the individual begins to interpret these patterns as external misfortune rather than internal repetition. Yet the underlying structure remains consistent. Avoidance generates delay, delay reduces competence, reduced competence reinforces avoidance. This cycle tightens over time, making escape increasingly difficult not because of external barriers, but because of accumulated internal conditioning. The longer this continues, the more identity becomes entangled with unfinished effort. The person no longer simply experiences stagnation, they begin to embody it as a default mode of operation. Breaking the illusion of rescue does not arrive as comfort, it arrives as clarity that removes the possibility of continued avoidance. Once the expectation of external intervention dissolves, what remains is the undeniable presence of choice at every level of existence. This is not a motivational idea, but a structural reality that becomes visible only when dependency on external resolution is fully interrupted. At this point, responsibility is no longer something assigned or accepted, it is something revealed. Every moment becomes a point of initiation rather than observation, and every decision becomes an expression of ownership rather than reaction. The shift begins quietly, not through dramatic transformation but through the recognition that waiting has no further justification. Action no longer requires emotional certainty or external validation to begin, it requires only acknowledgement of agency. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it redefines its meaning. Difficulty is no longer a signal to pause until rescue arrives, but a condition through which capability is developed. The internal narrative changes from asking when change will come to recognizing that change has always depended on movement initiated from within. As this perspective stabilizes, hesitation loses its authority. The individual begins to operate without requiring permission from imagined future conditions. What once felt like risk begins to feel like participation in reality itself. Gradually, the weight of false hope is replaced by the stability of direct engagement. This is not instant empowerment, but consistent alignment between perception and action. The illusion no longer competes for attention, because attention is no longer available to sustain it. What emerges is a form of clarity that does not rely on optimism, but on recognition. In that recognition, life is no longer postponed, and responsibility becomes the natural state of being rather than an imposed burden. Human existence begins in a condition that is often misunderstood because it is rarely experienced in its pure form. Every perception you have ever held, every sensation, every interpretation of reality, occurs inside a single point of awareness that cannot be transferred, shared, or fully replicated. Even when two people stand in the same room, looking at the same object, hearing the same sound, what exists inside them is not a shared experience but two separate interpretations constructed in isolation. The mind may create the feeling of connection, but perception itself remains indivisible. This is the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. Each life is a sealed perspective, experiencing a universe that cannot be directly entered by another. From this standpoint, solitude is not an exception but the baseline condition of existence. The presence of others does not dissolve this boundary, it only creates the illusion that it has been softened. Communication bridges expression, not experience. Language transmits symbols, not sensation. Even the deepest emotional bonds exist as parallel experiences rather than merged realities. Yet most people never confront this directly because attention is constantly drawn outward, toward interaction, validation, and shared narrative. The discomfort of this truth is avoided by constructing a social reality where isolation feels abnormal, as if being alone in perception is a deviation rather than the default state. But beneath all interaction, beneath every relationship and structure, consciousness remains singular, observing through one lens that no other can occupy. Recognizing this does not diminish life, it clarifies it. It removes the expectation that understanding must be fully shared in order to be valid. It reveals that every moment is privately witnessed, privately processed, and privately stored, regardless of external presence. Loneliness is often treated as a signal of deficiency, as if the absence of constant external engagement indicates something incomplete within the individual. This interpretation is not inherent to experience itself but constructed through comparison. People learn to evaluate their state by measuring it against continuous social input, and when that input decreases, the mind labels the resulting silence as lack. Yet what is being described as loneliness is often nothing more than the absence of distraction from the underlying condition of being a single experiencing center. The discomfort arises not because solitude is unnatural, but because it reveals the structure that is usually hidden beneath interaction. In moments of reduced external stimulation, the mind is forced to confront its own uninterrupted presence, and this confrontation is mistaken for isolation. Society reinforces the idea that being alone is synonymous with being weak because it benefits from constant participation. Productivity, consumption, communication, and identity formation all rely on continuous engagement with external systems. As a result, the natural state of internal independence is reframed as something undesirable, something to be fixed rather than understood. But weakness is not found in solitude, it is often found in the inability to remain stable without external reinforcement. The discomfort of being alone is not evidence of failure, but evidence of withdrawal from dependency. When this is misread, individuals begin to chase constant stimulation to avoid the quiet recognition of their own uninterrupted existence. They mistake noise for stability, and presence of others for internal balance. Yet the underlying condition does not change regardless of external volume. Life itself is structured in a way that gradually removes external scaffolding, regardless of personal readiness. Early existence often creates the illusion of dependence through caregivers, institutions, and systems that absorb decision-making on behalf of the individual. However, this phase is temporary by design. As time progresses, responsibilities shift inward, and choices that were once distributed begin to concentrate into personal accountability. Education ends, parental structures recede, social roles change, and eventually every individual is placed into conditions where outcomes are determined primarily by their own actions. This transition is not abrupt but cumulative, unfolding through repeated experiences where external support becomes less reliable and internal decision-making becomes more critical. Even relationships, while meaningful, cannot carry the full weight of direction or consequence. Each person eventually encounters situations where no external voice provides resolution, and action must be taken without certainty or permission. This is not an anomaly but a consistent pattern in human development. The environment does not maintain permanent dependence because survival itself requires adaptation, and adaptation requires internal agency. Yet many resist this progression by attempting to preserve earlier states of reliance, searching for structures that replicate childhood certainty within adult reality. This resistance creates friction, because life continues to move toward independence regardless of preference. Over time, the expectation that someone else will provide direction becomes increasingly unrealistic, not because support disappears, but because responsibility becomes too complex to be outsourced. The moment solitude is fully perceived rather than avoided, it often produces an emotional response that is difficult to articulate because it is not tied to any specific event. It is a quiet intensity that arises when the mind recognizes the absence of external anchors for meaning, validation, or direction. This discomfort is frequently interpreted as something wrong within the individual, yet it is more accurately described as the nervous system adjusting to a truth it has long been shielded from. The sensation of isolation is not created by being alone, but by the removal of distractions that previously masked the continuity of self-awareness. When external noise diminishes, the mind becomes more sensitive to its own presence, and this heightened awareness can feel unfamiliar. Many attempt to resolve this feeling by immediately re-engaging with external input, returning to communication, media, or social environments in order to restore the previous equilibrium of distraction. However, this response delays understanding rather than eliminating the condition. The discomfort itself is not harmful, it is informative. It indicates a shift from externally distributed attention to internally centered awareness. The difficulty lies in interpreting this shift as something to escape rather than something to observe. When resistance is reduced, the emotional intensity begins to stabilize, not because the condition changes, but because interpretation changes. What once felt like emptiness gradually reveals itself as unfiltered awareness, no longer shaped by external reinforcement. This transition can feel unsettling at first, but it is part of recalibration toward a more direct experience of existence, where perception is no longer filtered through constant external reference points and begins to rest in its own uninterrupted field. Acceptance of solitude does not require the invention of new meaning, but the removal of unnecessary distortion around what already exists. When the expectation of constant external completion is released, the experience of being alone ceases to carry the weight of deficiency. Instead, it becomes recognizable as the natural structure through which all perception operates. There is no additional layer required to make experience valid, it is already complete within its own frame of awareness. This recognition shifts solitude from something endured to something understood. In this understanding, internal stability no longer depends on continuous validation or external presence. The mind becomes less reactive to absence because absence is no longer interpreted as loss. Instead, it is seen as neutral space within which clarity can arise without interference. Over time, this perspective creates a quieter form of peace, not based on satisfaction from external fulfillment, but on alignment with the actual conditions of existence. The need to escape oneself diminishes, because there is no longer a belief that something essential is missing in the structure of being alone. What remains is a more grounded relationship with experience, where attention is no longer split between reality and imagined completion. Solitude, in this sense, is not an emotional state but an accurate description of how consciousness functions. When this is fully acknowledged, internal resistance softens, and a stable form of presence emerges that does not rely on external correction. In that stability, solitude is no longer an absence to be filled, but the fundamental condition through which life is directly known. The moment arrives without announcement, as if reality itself pauses long enough for you to finally see what has always been present beneath your distractions. There is no dramatic sound, no external shift, only a subtle collapse of internal noise that once kept you comfortable. In that silence, you begin to recognize that everything you have avoided thinking about has been quietly waiting for your attention. The truth does not attack you, it simply becomes visible. You realize that much of your life has been lived in postponement, in imagined futures where understanding would come later, where clarity would arrive through someone else, where answers would be delivered in a form that required no confrontation. But in this moment, none of that arrives. What arrives instead is the undeniable presence of yourself, stripped of explanation, stripped of justification, standing in the center of awareness without anything to soften the view. The mind does not immediately accept this position, it resists by searching for familiar exits, yet every exit feels strangely absent. Even memory begins to lose its comforting distortion as it is observed without interpretation. You are not becoming something new in this instant, you are simply no longer avoiding what has always been there beneath every layer of distraction, and that absence of escape creates a pressure that feels both unfamiliar and strangely precise, as if reality has finally stopped negotiating with your expectations. Avoidance reveals itself in layers once you are forced to remain still long enough to observe it. You remember how easily the mind turns toward distraction when discomfort begins to surface. Small escapes disguised as necessity, constant movement disguised as productivity, noise disguised as connection. Each of these behaviors functions as a quiet refusal to remain in contact with inner reality. Denial is not always dramatic, often it is subtle, almost invisible, embedded in routine. You scroll, you speak, you plan, you consume, all while ensuring that nothing within you becomes too clear. The escape is not from life itself, but from direct confrontation with your own state of being. Yet even the most refined avoidance eventually loses its effectiveness. The moments between distractions begin to expand, and in those expanding gaps, what you have been avoiding begins to surface without force. At first it appears as restlessness, then as irritation, then as an undefined pressure that has no external source. The mind attempts to label it so it can regain control, but labeling does not dissolve it. Instead, the structure of avoidance becomes visible in hindsight, like patterns drawn across time that were never seen while they were being created. What once felt like harmless distraction now reveals itself as systematic distance from truth, carefully maintained through repetition until it felt natural. Honesty with oneself carries a weight that cannot be fully anticipated until it is experienced directly. It is not punishment, but exposure without protection. You begin to notice thoughts that were always present but previously softened by interpretation. Regret appears not as memory alone, but as recognition of patterns repeated without interruption. Fear becomes less about external outcomes and more about internal acknowledgement. There is discomfort in seeing your own decisions without narrative defense, without the comforting structure of excuses that once made everything feel manageable. The mind resists this clarity because clarity removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where avoidance survives. Yet beneath the resistance, something quieter emerges, a recognition that what feels unbearable is not the truth itself, but the absence of distortion around it. You begin to see how often interpretation was used to reduce intensity rather than understand reality. Each explanation that once protected your self-image now feels like a layer placed over something simpler and more direct. The emotional system reacts strongly not because harm is occurring, but because protection is being withdrawn. In that withdrawal, perception sharpens, and what was once blurred by justification becomes sharply defined, leaving no space for selective understanding. To see yourself without illusion is to remove every layer that once allowed you to interpret your actions in a more favorable light. There is no audience in this moment, no comparison, no justification through context. Only the raw continuity of choices and their consequences laid out without alteration. You begin to understand that excuses were never external realities, but internal constructions designed to preserve comfort. Even identity, when observed closely, appears less fixed and more assembled from repeated avoidance and selective memory. The discomfort intensifies not because truth is harsh, but because truth is unfiltered. It does not adjust to your readiness. It does not soften to preserve emotional stability. It simply remains what it is, and you remain in contact with it without interruption. In this state, there is nowhere to redirect attention except inward. The absence of external escape routes creates a forced proximity to the self that cannot be bypassed through thought or distraction. You are no longer negotiating with perception, you are experiencing it without buffer. What once felt like a stable sense of identity begins to reveal itself as a continuous process of reinterpretation, shaped more by avoidance than by accuracy, and in that realization, the structure of self becomes both fragile and transparent. Transformation begins not as relief, but as recognition that escape is no longer structurally possible. Once every external distraction loses its ability to fully contain your awareness, attention returns repeatedly to the same center without fragmentation. In this return, something stabilizes. You stop negotiating with truth and begin observing it directly, without requiring it to be different in order to be acceptable. Self-awareness becomes less of an event and more of a condition, continuous rather than intermittent. The intensity of confrontation gradually shifts into clarity, not because reality changes, but because resistance diminishes. What remains is a quieter form of presence where action is no longer delayed by internal conflict between perception and acknowledgement. You begin to move in alignment with what is seen rather than what is hoped, and in that alignment, the need for escape dissolves, not through force, but through irrelevance. The mind no longer seeks refuge because refuge is no longer interpreted as necessary. What once felt like exposure now feels like simplicity, and what once felt like confrontation now feels like direct contact with reality without distortion. In that state, the mirror moment does not end, it integrates, becoming the baseline from which all further experience is witnessed without separation. Responsibility is not a burden placed upon life, it is the structural foundation upon which real power is built. The moment a person begins to recognize that every outcome in their life is connected, directly or indirectly, to a choice they made or failed to make, perception shifts from passive observation to active authorship. This does not mean ignoring external forces or pretending that circumstances do not exist, but rather understanding that circumstances only become decisive through response. Until response occurs, events remain neutral. Responsibility transforms neutrality into direction. It is the bridge between experience and influence. Without it, a person remains at the mercy of interpretation, constantly reacting instead of shaping. With it, even limitation becomes material for construction. This is where true strength begins, not in control over everything, but in acknowledgement of one's role within everything. Once responsibility is accepted at this level, excuses lose structural integrity. They can no longer sustain behavior, because awareness interrupts repetition. What once felt like randomness reveals itself as pattern, and what felt like external force reveals itself as accumulated decisions. In this recognition, power stops being something sought outside and becomes something exercised internally through consistent ownership of outcomes, regardless of comfort or emotional preference. Responsibility also removes the illusion that waiting will correct direction on its own. Time does not repair indecision, it amplifies it. Without ownership, time feels external, but with ownership, time becomes a tool shaped by choices. This shift changes how delay, failure, and decision are interpreted. Failure becomes feedback rather than identity, and delay becomes a conscious cost rather than passive waiting. Blame is one of the most seductive mental structures because it allows a person to remain emotionally invested in their situation without ever becoming accountable for it. It creates the illusion of understanding while avoiding the demand of action. When blame becomes the default response, life is interpreted through external causation alone, where every outcome is assigned to another person, system, or circumstance. This preserves emotional comfort but eliminates internal authority. In contrast, ownership mentality does not deny external influence, but it refuses to end interpretation there. It asks a deeper question about participation in outcomes, focusing on what was controlled, what was ignored, and what was allowed to continue. The difference between these two mental states is not intellectual but structural. One places the individual as a receiver of life, while the other places them as an active participant in shaping it. Blame feels immediate because it requires no internal restructuring. Ownership feels demanding because it requires re-evaluation of personal behavior across time. However, only one of these states produces long-term change. Blame sustains narrative without transformation, while ownership disrupts narrative in order to produce transformation. Over time, habitual blame creates dependency on external correction. The person waits for conditions to change before changing behavior, reversing growth. Action is expected to come from circumstances rather than self-initiation, trapping potential in expectation. Ownership breaks this loop by returning focus to present decision-making, the only real point of influence. It removes external assignment of responsibility and replaces it with direct accountability for response. Excuses then lose authority because they no longer explain outcomes, they only reveal avoidance. Control is not something granted by external stability, it is produced through internal accountability. When a person refuses responsibility, they simultaneously surrender control over interpretation, reaction, and direction. Life then feels unpredictable not because it is inherently chaotic, but because the individual is not actively participating in shaping responses to it. Accountability restores control by anchoring attention to the only domain where influence is consistently available: choice. Every choice, no matter how small, contributes to the structure of future outcomes. When this is understood, control is no longer imagined as domination over external events, but as consistency in internal response. A person does not need to control everything, they need to stop abandoning themselves in moments that require decision. Accountability turns scattered reactions into coherent action by removing fragmentation between intention and execution. Without it, behavior becomes reactive and inconsistent, shaped by immediate emotion rather than deliberate direction. With it, even uncertainty becomes navigable because response remains anchored in ownership rather than fear or avoidance. This creates a form of internal stability that does not depend on external predictability. Instead of waiting for conditions to feel safe before acting, accountable individuals act and then adjust based on feedback. This reverses the passive cycle of hesitation. Control emerges not from certainty, but from consistent engagement with consequence. Each outcome becomes data rather than judgment, allowing refinement without emotional collapse. Over time, this builds psychological resilience because identity is no longer tied to isolated results but to continuous participation in responsibility. Even failure loses its destabilizing power, because it is integrated into a system of learning rather than interpreted as disruption. Emotional resistance to responsibility is one of the strongest internal forces because it is disguised as protection. The mind resists ownership not because it fails to understand it, but because it recognizes the cost of full exposure. Responsibility removes the ability to distance oneself from outcomes, and this creates discomfort in systems that were built around avoidance. Emotional resistance often appears as procrastination, rationalization, fatigue, or sudden loss of clarity when action becomes necessary. These states are not random, they are protective responses designed to preserve familiarity. The familiar condition, even when limiting, feels safer than the uncertainty of full accountability. This is why individuals often return to patterns they already know, even when those patterns produce dissatisfaction. Responsibility demands a break from emotional negotiation, which the mind initially interprets as pressure or threat. In reality, it is simply the removal of internal escape routes that once allowed avoidance to continue without consequence. The resistance is not proof that responsibility is wrong, it is evidence that it is effective in disrupting old psychological structures. As resistance intensifies, the mind may reframe accountability as overwhelming or unfair, but these interpretations are part of avoidance seeking control. The discomfort arises because responsibility removes separation between action and identity. There is no space where intention can exist without execution. This integration forces coherence, which initially feels restrictive to a mind used to selective engagement. Yet what feels like restriction is consolidation. Energy once used for justifying inaction becomes available for directed behavior. Emotional resistance decreases only when it is no longer fed by avoidance. Full ownership of outcomes transforms perception from fragmented reaction into unified agency. When an individual no longer divides life into external causes and internal effects, everything becomes part of a single continuous system of responsibility. This does not create pressure in the destructive sense, it creates clarity. Each moment becomes an active point of influence rather than a passive result of circumstance. Empowerment emerges not from controlling outcomes, but from eliminating denial of participation in them. When ownership is complete, even difficult situations lose their ability to destabilize identity, because identity is no longer built on outcomes but on response. The focus shifts from what happens to how one engages with what happens. This shift is fundamental, because it removes the illusion of helplessness that comes from externalizing causation. In its place, a grounded awareness develops where action is always available, even when options are limited. Power becomes less about expansion and more about alignment with responsibility in real time. In this state, setbacks are no longer seen as failure, but as information within a larger system of consequence. Emotional charge decreases because outcomes are not tied to identity, but to process refinement. This is clarity, not indifference, separating self from temporary results. As ownership deepens, hesitation weakens, because uncertainty no longer requires resolution before action. Action becomes the method through which uncertainty is processed. This changes the relationship between thought and behavior. Thinking no longer delays action, but supports it. Over time, discipline replaces emotional fluctuation as the guiding force. The individual becomes less reactive to validation or criticism, because both are external interpretations rather than internal definitions. What remains is steady engagement with responsibility, regardless of emotional state. In isolation, a person is no longer interpreted through the reflections of others, and what remains is the unfiltered structure of character itself. Without social reinforcement, every habit, impulse, and belief becomes visible in its raw form, unedited and uninterrupted by external interpretation. In this condition, there is no performance, no adaptation to expectation, and no escape into social roles that previously shaped identity. The mirror of solitude removes all borrowed definitions of self, leaving only what is consistently chosen and repeated in action. In such solitude, comparison dissolves, because there is nothing left to compare except the continuity of one's own behavior across time. Isolation becomes a measuring field where discipline is no longer theoretical but observable in repetition. What persists in silence is not identity as it is presented to others, but identity as it is enacted without witness. In the absence of validation, only internal structure determines direction, and structure is revealed through consistency rather than intention. Without external interruption, the mind begins to recognize patterns that were previously hidden beneath noise and distraction. This recognition is not sudden insight, but accumulation of uninterrupted self-observation over time. Isolation therefore functions as a training ground where awareness is stripped of dependence and forced into clarity through repetition. In this discipline, isolation is no longer absence of connection, but presence of uninterrupted truth. The more time spent without distraction, the more clearly behavior reveals what has been built internally, regardless of outward expression. In isolation, there is no performance left, only evidence of what discipline has truly become when no one is watching. Nothing else remains when isolation is fully understood as structure, not circumstance. We continue. Silence is often perceived as emptiness, yet it is actually the removal of external interference that usually prevents direct contact with internal reality. In silence, the mind loses its habitual distractions and begins to experience the raw continuity of thought without interruption. Difficulty arises not because silence is harmful, but because it removes the constant stimulation that previously masked internal instability. In isolation, every thought becomes louder because there is no external noise to compete with internal dialogue. This amplification creates discomfort, not because something is wrong, but because what was previously ignored becomes unavoidable. Silence strips away distraction, leaving only the raw mechanisms of thinking exposed without interpretation or escape. In this exposure, a person begins to recognize that discomfort is not created by silence itself, but by the confrontation with internal structure that silence reveals. The absence of external validation intensifies awareness of internal inconsistency, forcing patterns of avoidance into visibility. Without distraction, there is no longer separation between thinker and thought, only continuous observation of mental process. This merging creates discomfort because identity relies heavily on separation and narrative control, both of which dissolve in silence. With repeated exposure, the discomfort begins to lose intensity, not because silence changes, but because resistance weakens. Discipline in silence is not the absence of discomfort, but the ability to remain present despite it, allowing structure to form where chaos once dominated. In this environment, strength is not expressed through reaction, but through sustained attention to internal reality without escape, repetition forming the foundation of mental stability. Over time, silence becomes less of a challenge and more of a structured state where awareness operates without interruption or dependency on external stimulation. Discipline formed in isolation is fundamentally different from discipline built under observation, because it is not reinforced by external approval. In solitude, discipline is no longer a response to being seen, but a structure maintained in the absence of being seen. Without external validation, repetition becomes the only form of reinforcement available. This repetition is not mechanical routine alone, but the gradual construction of internal reliability. In external environments, discipline often collapses when recognition is removed. In isolation, it either strengthens or disappears completely, revealing true structure. The absence of observers eliminates performance, and what remains is behavior in its most accurate form. Discipline without validation is uncomfortable because it removes the psychological reward system that normally sustains effort. In silence, there is no external reinforcement to signal progress, so discipline must become internally generated rather than externally triggered. In this shift, effort is no longer dependent on recognition, but on internal agreement between intention and action. Sustained discipline in isolation produces a form of reliability that does not fluctuate with emotional state or external feedback. Weakness in solitude is not the presence of difficulty, but the absence of sustained practice under conditions of silence. Over time, repetition without validation builds internal structure that remains stable regardless of external conditions, forming discipline that does not require reinforcement to persist. This is the foundation of discipline in isolation, where behavior becomes self-sustaining through internal consistency rather than external approval. With continued practice, silence no longer functions as a test of willpower but becomes the environment in which discipline operates naturally without resistance or dependency on external reinforcement. Fully formed. Growth in isolation is not the result of sudden insight, but the accumulation of repeated action performed without external validation. In repetition, structure is not imposed but formed gradually through consistency. Each repeated action becomes a reinforcement of internal discipline when no external reward is present. In solitude, repetition replaces motivation as the primary driver of growth, because consistency removes dependence on emotional fluctuation. Without external reinforcement, growth becomes measurable only through accumulated change in behavior over time. Structure emerges when action is repeated without variation driven by external influence, allowing internal patterns to stabilize. Growth in isolation is slow, not because effort is lacking, but because validation is removed and must be replaced by internal continuity. In this environment, discipline becomes self-maintaining rather than externally reinforced. Repetition creates structure, and structure creates reliability, which eventually replaces the need for external motivation. Without external validation, repetition becomes the only source of reinforcement available for sustained growth. Over time, this creates a form of discipline that is independent of circumstance, relying only on internal structure and repetition. At this stage, growth is no longer dependent on motivation, but on structural repetition that sustains itself in silence. Discipline becomes a stable system rather than a fluctuating response to external conditions. Through repetition without validation, discipline becomes less about effort and more about structural consistency built over time. This is how repetition transforms into identity-level structure, where action no longer depends on emotional fluctuation. It stabilizes discipline itself. Strength in isolation is not inherited, but constructed through repeated confrontation with silence and internal resistance. In repeated isolation, strength becomes less about reaction and more about sustained presence. Silence removes external reinforcement, forcing strength to emerge from internal structure alone. In this process, discomfort becomes the signal that dependence is being removed and replaced with self-generated stability. Strength is not a result of comfort but of repeated exposure to internal pressure without escape. In isolation, endurance becomes a learned state rather than an emotional response. Repeated silence conditions the mind to operate without external reassurance, forming resilience through internal repetition. In this state, strength is not emotional intensity but structural consistency under absence of validation. Over time, repetition transforms isolation into a training ground where strength becomes automatic rather than forced. Strength formed in silence does not depend on motivation, but on repetition that stabilizes behavior over time. Isolation refines strength by removing dependency on external validation loops. With repetition, internal resistance weakens, and stability becomes the natural state of being alone. Strength in solitude is ultimately the result of sustained repetition under conditions where no external reinforcement exists. In this absence, discipline and strength merge into a single continuous structure built through repetition. It is not motivated, but maintained through internal consistency that does not break under silence. Through this process, isolation becomes the environment where strength is permanently constructed. Nothing external is required once repetition has fully formed internal structure. This is the discipline of isolation. Built without audience, maintained without reward, and strengthened through repetition alone. It remains when everything else is removed. Only repetition remains. It is enough. Emotional pain in isolation does not arrive as a single event, but as a slow unveiling of internal weight that was previously distributed across distractions and external connections. When silence becomes persistent, what was once buffered by interaction begins to surface with uncompromising clarity. There is no longer the illusion of diffusion, no other presence to absorb the intensity of internal experience. Pain, in this state, becomes concentrated. It is not amplified by solitude, it is revealed by it. Every unresolved emotion, every suppressed reaction, every unprocessed memory begins to surface in layers, not because solitude creates them, but because solitude removes what was covering them. In the absence of distraction, the mind loses its ability to fragment experience into manageable pieces, and instead encounters emotion in its complete form. This encounter feels overwhelming only because it is uninterrupted. Yet within this intensity lies information that was previously inaccessible. Emotional pain becomes less of a disturbance and more of a signal pointing toward internal structure that has been neglected. In isolation, there is no escape route that redirects attention outward, so awareness is forced inward, where the raw architecture of emotional experience is exposed. This exposure is uncomfortable, but it is also precise. It reveals not only what is felt, but how it has been carried, avoided, and delayed over time. In this way, isolation becomes a space where emotional truth cannot be negotiated or softened, only observed in its unfiltered state. Within this environment, the nervous system begins to recalibrate its relationship with intensity, learning that what once felt like threat is actually unprocessed presence demanding attention. The breaking point in isolation rarely appears as a single dramatic collapse. It unfolds as a gradual erosion of internal resistance until the mind can no longer sustain the structures it used to avoid itself. What once felt manageable through distraction becomes unbearable when distraction is no longer available. The individual begins to encounter their own internal limits not as abstract concepts, but as lived experience. Thoughts loop without resolution, emotions intensify without release, and the absence of external interruption amplifies the confrontation. This is the phase where internal struggle becomes undeniable. The mind attempts to reconstruct escape routes, revisiting memories, imagine futures, and alternative narratives that could soften the intensity of the present moment. Yet each attempt collapses back into the same space, because there is nowhere else for attention to go. The breaking point is not destruction, but saturation. It is the moment when avoidance loses efficiency and the system can no longer maintain fragmentation of experience. In this state, resistance becomes visible as exhaustion rather than action. The individual is no longer actively avoiding, they are experiencing the collapse of avoidance itself. This creates a tension between what was previously controlled and what is now exposed, and within that tension, the internal structure begins to reveal its actual limits. What follows is not immediate clarity, but a dense confrontation with accumulated unresolved material that can no longer be deferred. At this point, perception begins to narrow, focusing only on what is immediately present, as long-term narratives lose their ability to stabilize emotion. The struggle is no longer between external conditions and internal preference, but between acceptance and continued resistance to what is already unfolding. Suffering in isolation undergoes a transformation when it is no longer interpreted through resistance but through observation. What was once categorized as purely negative begins to reveal structural information about internal capacity, reaction patterns, and emotional endurance. In this shift, suffering is no longer a signal of collapse, but a signal of exposure. The mind begins to recognize that pain, when fully observed without avoidance, contains direction rather than chaos. This does not diminish its intensity, but it changes its function. Instead of being an experience to escape, it becomes material to analyze, understand, and ultimately integrate. Reframing does not remove difficulty, it changes the relationship to difficulty. The same experience that once fragmented awareness now consolidates it, forcing attention into clarity rather than dispersion. Strength begins to emerge not from the absence of suffering, but from the ability to remain present within it without fragmentation. In this process, perception shifts from victimhood of experience to interpretation of experience as data. Emotional intensity becomes less threatening when it is no longer misinterpreted as damage, but understood as information indicating areas of unresolved internal structure. Over time, this reframing reduces internal conflict, allowing energy previously spent on resistance to be redirected toward constructive engagement. In this way, suffering becomes a raw material for discipline rather than a symbol of defeat. This alchemy is not intellectual, but experiential, occurring through sustained exposure rather than conceptual understanding. As repetition of reframed perception continues, the nervous system gradually stops categorizing intensity as threat and begins to register it as usable energy for directed action. What once destabilized focus becomes the very condition that sharpens it. Converting pain into productive action requires a shift from internal absorption to external expression of energy. When emotional intensity is no longer suppressed or avoided, it becomes available as fuel for structured movement. The mind learns that suffering does not need to remain internalized, it can be redirected into behavior that produces tangible outcomes. This redirection is not automatic, but it becomes possible once resistance is reduced. Pain, when held without avoidance, generates pressure. That pressure, if left unstructured, manifests as overwhelm, but when directed, becomes force. Productive action emerges when internal tension is translated into external execution through discipline. This process requires structure, because without structure, energy disperses into rumination or emotional repetition. Structure gives pain a path to exit the internal system and enter the external world as action. In this transformation, suffering is no longer static experience, it becomes motion. Each moment of discomfort becomes an opportunity to convert emotional intensity into deliberate effort. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where action reduces internal tension, and reduced tension increases clarity, reinforcing further action. In this way, pain is no longer something endured, but something utilized. The individual begins to understand that energy previously spent on resistance can be redirected toward creation, discipline, and consistent output. This is where internal struggle becomes external progress. With repetition, this conversion becomes less intentional and more automatic, as the mind begins to associate discomfort with initiation rather than avoidance. What was once a trigger for withdrawal becomes a signal for engagement. Mastery through emotional transformation is achieved when internal experience no longer dictates behavior, but instead becomes integrated into a structured system of response. At this stage, emotions are no longer obstacles to action, but signals that inform direction. The individual no longer attempts to eliminate emotional intensity, but learns to operate through it without distortion. This creates a state where awareness and action are aligned, and internal fluctuations no longer disrupt external consistency. Mastery is not the absence of emotion, but the absence of fragmentation caused by emotion. Through sustained practice in solitude, the individual develops the ability to remain stable while experiencing internal variability. This stability allows for precise execution regardless of emotional state. Over time, emotional reactions lose authority over behavior, and discipline becomes the primary governing structure. In this transformation, solitude is no longer a place of struggle, but a condition for refinement. The individual begins to operate with clarity that is independent of internal turbulence, using emotional energy as input rather than interference. This is the final stage of transformation, where pain, discipline, and awareness merge into a unified system of action. What was once internal conflict becomes integrated intelligence guiding consistent mastery. In this state, discipline is no longer a practice that must be enforced, but a default orientation of being. The nervous system adapts to consistency, and the mind stops negotiating with resistance because resistance has lost structural support. Each experience, whether comfortable or painful, is processed through the same framework of engagement rather than avoidance. Over time, this creates a deep internal reliability where action is not dependent on mood, but on identity-level alignment with purpose. The collapse of external support systems does not arrive as a single event but as a gradual withdrawal of everything you once assumed would remain stable. People you depended on become inconsistent, institutions reveal limitations, and circumstances that once felt secure begin to shift without warning. In this transition, the mind initially resists acceptance, searching for previous patterns of reliability that no longer function in the same way. What feels like sudden abandonment is often the natural fading of external scaffolding that was never designed to carry permanent responsibility for your direction. As these structures weaken, awareness begins to shift inward, revealing that much of what was considered stability was actually temporary support rather than foundational strength. This realization is not immediate empowerment but disorientation, because it removes familiar reference points without yet replacing them with internal structure. The absence of external certainty forces attention towards self-generated direction, even when that direction is not yet developed. In this space, dependency becomes visible not as comfort, but as vulnerability exposed by withdrawal of external reinforcement. What remains is the necessity to confront the question of whether stability was ever truly outside you or merely projected onto systems and people that were always limited in their capacity to sustain it. As this realization deepens, emotional response becomes quiet stripping away of assumptions shaping expectations. What felt like injustice begins to reveal structure rather than punishment. Absence of support exposes that stability was never guaranteed externally, only temporarily supplemented. The mind sees reliance on permanence as misread temporary assistance. Dependency weakens the individual not because support itself is harmful, but because reliance without internal development creates imbalance between expectation and capability. When decisions are consistently outsourced to external sources, internal judgment remains underdeveloped, and the ability to navigate uncertainty diminishes over time. This does not appear immediately as failure; instead, it manifests as hesitation, uncertainty, and increased emotional reaction when external guidance is unavailable. The more dependency is reinforced, the less tolerance exists for ambiguity, because internal systems have not been trained to operate without constant input. In this state, even small disruptions in external support can create disproportionate instability, revealing how fragile the structure of reliance becomes when it is not balanced by self-generated stability. Dependency also creates an illusion of safety, where discomfort is avoided by transferring responsibility outward, but this avoidance delays the development of resilience. Over time, the individual begins to associate comfort with presence of others rather than with internal regulation, making solitude feel threatening instead of neutral. Yet this perceived safety is conditional and fragile, because it depends entirely on factors outside personal control. As those factors change, so does emotional equilibrium, leaving the individual exposed to fluctuations they did not prepare for internally. Over time, this dependency shapes perception itself, narrowing the range of action an individual believes is possible without external input. Even simple decisions begin to feel heavier when internal judgment has not been trained through repetition. This creates a subtle erosion of confidence, not through failure, but through lack of practiced autonomy. The longer this pattern persists, the more the mind associates uncertainty with paralysis rather than exploration, reinforcing the cycle of reliance. Internal stability begins when attention shifts from external validation to consistent self-regulation across changing conditions. This does not require withdrawal from the world, but rather the development of an internal framework that remains steady regardless of external fluctuation. Stability is built through repetition of small, deliberate actions that reinforce trust in personal judgment. Each time a decision is made independently and sustained through its consequences, internal structure strengthens. Over time, this creates a baseline of reliability that does not depend on external approval or immediate results. Internal stability is not emotional rigidity, but the ability to remain centered while experiencing variation without collapse into reaction. It requires observing internal states without allowing them to dictate behavior automatically. Through this process, the mind learns to distinguish between temporary emotional signals and long-term directional clarity. As this distinction becomes clearer, reactions lose authority and are replaced by measured response. Stability is not achieved by eliminating uncertainty, but by developing the capacity to move through it without fragmentation. In this way, internal structure becomes the primary reference point for action, reducing dependence on external cues for decision-making. What emerges is a quiet consistency that is not visible as performance, but experienced as reliability in behavior over time. As this stability strengthens, decisions become less driven by emotional fluctuation and more anchored in consistency. The individual recognizes clarity as maintained condition built through alignment between thought and action. Internal conflict decreases, allowing energy from hesitation to shift into execution. Stability becomes self-sustaining, requiring less conscious effort and appearing naturally in behavior. This creates a quiet confidence that persists even in uncertain conditions over time within action. Emotional self-support develops when an individual stops relying on external sources to regulate internal states and begins to actively participate in their own emotional stabilization. This process involves recognizing emotional intensity without immediate escape or suppression, allowing it to be experienced fully while maintaining awareness of its temporary nature. Instead of seeking external validation or distraction, the individual learns to remain present with emotional fluctuations without allowing them to dictate long-term direction. Over time, this creates an internal capacity to contain emotional experience without fragmentation. Emotional self-support is not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to remain internally structured during difficulty. It requires replacing reactive patterns with conscious observation, where emotion is acknowledged but not automatically followed. In this state, emotional energy becomes information rather than command, allowing clearer decision-making even under pressure. Gradually, the need for external reassurance decreases, because internal regulation becomes sufficient to restore equilibrium. This does not eliminate emotional depth, but it stabilizes its influence. Instead of being pushed into extremes by internal states, the individual learns to move through them with awareness and continuity. Emotional self-support therefore becomes a foundational aspect of independence, where stability is generated internally rather than borrowed from external presence. With continued practice, emotional responses lose reactive dominance, allowing observation before action. This shift does not remove emotional depth but reorganizes influence so feelings inform rather than command behavior. Internal regulation strengthens over external stimulation, and need for reassurance diminishes as self-support becomes reliable. Full self-reliance emerges when internal structure becomes strong enough that external conditions no longer determine direction, but only provide context. At this stage, decisions are made from internal clarity rather than external pressure, and action is sustained through personal conviction rather than dependency on reinforcement. Self-reliance does not mean isolation from others, but independence of internal functioning regardless of external presence. The individual becomes capable of engaging with systems, relationships, and environments without losing internal coherence. External input may inform perspective, but it no longer dictates behavior. This creates a state of stability where uncertainty does not destabilize action, because direction is generated internally. Over time, reliance on external validation fades, not through rejection, but through redundancy, as internal systems become sufficient for navigation. In this condition, responsibility and capability align, producing consistent movement even in unpredictable environments. Self-reliance is not a fixed achievement but a maintained structure, reinforced through continued practice of internal decision-making. It represents a shift from dependence-based living to internally anchored existence, where the individual becomes the foundation of their own stability. In this state, life is no longer awaited or externally validated, but actively shaped through continuous engagement with personal responsibility and awareness. In this condition, action becomes consistent regardless of external fluctuation, because direction is generated internally rather than borrowed from environment. The individual no longer waits for certainty before movement, but uses movement itself to refine clarity. External circumstances may still shift, but they no longer disrupt internal coherence. Freedom from permission begins when the mind finally understands that waiting to be validated is the same as choosing to remain powerless. There is no moment in life where authority will arrive to certify your decisions as acceptable before you act. Every system that teaches you to wait for approval is built on the assumption that hesitation can be controlled. But real movement begins when permission is no longer part of the equation. The mind stops negotiating with external voices and starts operating from internal command. At first, this feels uncomfortable, because conditioning has trained you to associate safety with approval. Yet approval is not safety, it is delay disguised as structure. When you remove the need for it, something immediate shifts in perception. Actions no longer pause at the threshold of judgment. They pass through it without resistance. This is where mental freedom begins to take shape, not as rebellion, but as independence from unnecessary validation. The moment you realize no authority is coming to authorize your existence, your thinking becomes sharper, faster, and more direct. There is no longer energy wasted on interpretation of others' expectations. Instead, that energy is redirected into execution. In this state, hesitation loses its psychological foundation. You no longer ask whether something is allowed, you ask whether it is necessary, and then you act accordingly. This shift removes the invisible barrier that keeps most people locked in cycles of delayed action. Permission becomes irrelevant because responsibility replaces it as the governing principle of behavior. And once that replacement occurs, movement becomes continuous, unfiltered, and self-directed, without external approval shaping its direction. Social conditioning operates as an invisible framework that tells individuals when to speak, when to wait, and when to doubt themselves. From early life, rules are absorbed not only as instruction but as identity-shaping mechanisms. You are taught to observe before acting, to seek approval before deciding, and to measure worth through external reaction. Over time, this conditioning becomes automatic, creating hesitation that feels like caution but is actually control. The individual begins to filter every intention through imagined judgment of others, even when no judgment exists. This internal surveillance replaces instinct with hesitation. Social systems reinforce this pattern because predictable behavior is easier to manage than independent action. As a result, most people unconsciously delay their own decisions until they feel socially safe, even when safety is irrelevant to the action itself. This creates a life lived inside permission structures that were never consciously agreed upon. Breaking this pattern requires recognition that social conditioning is not truth, but repetition of external influence internalized over time. Once this is seen clearly, the authority of external opinion weakens. Actions begin to separate from imagined judgment, and internal direction becomes more dominant than social expectation. The mind stops asking how it will be perceived and starts focusing on what must be done. This shift does not remove awareness of society, but it removes dependency on it as a guiding force. In this stage, clarity emerges as social noise loses authority over internal decision-making. The individual begins to notice how much mental energy was previously spent on anticipating reactions that were never guaranteed. This recovery of attention creates space for direct action, unfiltered by imagined audiences or inherited fear of judgment. As conditioning weakens, confidence is no longer dependent on approval, but on execution itself. Internal decision-making authority is the point where mental freedom becomes structurally real rather than conceptually understood. It is the shift from reacting to external input toward generating direction from within. In this state, decisions are no longer filtered through fear of consequence shaped by others, but evaluated through internal logic and responsibility. The individual stops outsourcing certainty and begins building it through repeated self-directed action. Each decision reinforces trust in internal judgment, reducing dependency on external validation. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing system where clarity is produced through action rather than waiting for clarity before action. Authority shifts from environment to perception, and perception becomes trained through disciplined repetition. This is where hesitation begins to lose structural support, because there is no external gatekeeper left to approve movement. Instead, movement is governed by internal alignment with purpose and necessity. The mind becomes less fragmented, because it is no longer split between internal intention and external approval. It operates as a unified system where decision and execution are closely linked. This reduces internal conflict and increases precision in action, allowing consistency to replace doubt as the dominant operating pattern. As this structure strengthens, the individual begins to recognize that authority was never missing, only unused. Every moment of hesitation is revealed as a pause created by unnecessary negotiation between action and imagined judgment. Once that negotiation ends, decisions accelerate, not because risk disappears, but because internal clarity overrides fear-based delay. This produces a stable form of mental direction that does not fluctuate with external opinion or emotional instability. In this condition, action becomes immediate reflection of thought, and thought becomes structured by discipline rather than hesitation. Persistence despite resistance is the true measure of mental strength, because resistance will always appear whenever change threatens established internal patterns. The mind resists not because progress is harmful, but because unfamiliarity challenges the comfort of repetition. In this stage, discipline is not defined by ease, but by continuation despite internal friction. Every form of resistance, whether emotional, mental, or environmental, becomes a signal that movement is occurring beyond previous limitations. Instead of interpreting resistance as a reason to stop, it is recognized as evidence of direction. The individual learns to continue action even when internal signals attempt to slow or redirect behavior toward comfort. This creates separation between impulse and execution, allowing discipline to override temporary discomfort. Persistence is not emotional endurance alone, but structured continuation of behavior aligned with intent regardless of fluctuation. Over time, resistance loses authority because it no longer results in withdrawal. It becomes background noise that does not interrupt execution. The mind begins to associate persistence with identity, not effort, meaning that continuation becomes default rather than exception. This reconditioning shifts behavior from reactive withdrawal to stable progression, where momentum is maintained even under pressure. In this state, stopping requires justification, while continuing requires none, reversing the earlier pattern of hesitation-driven delay. Resistance is no longer interpreted as failure of capacity, but as confirmation that internal boundaries are being expanded through repetition of disciplined action. This perspective reduces emotional disruption and increases focus on continuation rather than avoidance. With this shift, the mind becomes less reactive and more procedural, executing decisions without pausing to negotiate with discomfort or doubt. Continuity strengthens identity. Becoming mentally unstoppable is not a moment of arrival, but a state of continuous alignment between intention and execution under all conditions. It is where the mind no longer negotiates with doubt, hesitation, or external influence when forming direction. Instead, it operates from a stabilized internal structure where action is primary and interpretation follows. In this state, resistance loses psychological leverage because it no longer interrupts continuity. The individual does not wait for optimal conditions, emotional readiness, or external permission. Movement becomes default response to awareness of necessity. Over time, repetition of this pattern removes fragmentation between thought and action, creating seamless execution. Mental dominance is not aggression toward the world, but precision within oneself. It is the ability to remain consistent regardless of internal fluctuation or external disruption. In this condition, discipline is no longer enforced through effort but sustained through identity. The mind recognizes hesitation as unnecessary delay rather than protective strategy. As a result, execution becomes immediate, structured, and unbroken. This is the point where mental instability is replaced by operational clarity, and every decision reinforces the same internal architecture. Nothing external is required to initiate movement because initiation is internalized as permanent function. The unstoppable mind is not one that never feels resistance, but one that no longer grants resistance authority over behavior. In this final structure, clarity and discipline merge into a single operating system where action defines identity more than thought or emotion. Each moment becomes an execution point rather than a point of hesitation, reinforcing continuous forward motion. The mind no longer seeks validation of direction because direction is produced internally without delay or permission. Consistency becomes identity itself. No hesitation remains. Full acceptance of solitude does not arrive as comfort, but as recognition that no external presence was ever guaranteed to carry the weight of your existence. There is a point in awareness where every illusion of constant companionship dissolves, not through tragedy, but through clarity. You begin to see that even when surrounded by people, decisions were always executed alone, interpretations were always formed alone, and consequences were always experienced alone. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is structural reality. Every human mind operates as a closed system of perception, and no matter how close another person stands, they cannot enter the internal space where experience actually occurs. At first, this realization feels heavy, because it removes the comforting distortion that life is collectively carried. But beneath that weight is something more stable than comfort, truth without dependency. Solitude stops being an exception and becomes the baseline condition of awareness. Once this is understood, the mind no longer searches for missing presence to complete itself. Instead, it begins to recognize that completeness was never external. The resistance to this truth fades only when denial becomes more exhausting than acceptance. In that moment, solitude is no longer something endured, but something acknowledged as the natural structure of consciousness itself. And within that acknowledgement, a quiet shift begins where dependence weakens and internal clarity begins to stabilize without permission from anything outside the self. When loneliness is no longer interpreted as absence, it transforms into exposure of internal strength that was previously unused. What once felt like isolation begins to reveal itself as uninterrupted space where awareness can finally operate without distortion. In this space, there is no audience to perform for, no expectation to satisfy, and no external rhythm to follow. At first, this feels like emptiness because the mind is conditioned to associate activity with validation. But as the noise settles, something unexpected appears: capacity. The same silence that once felt like abandonment becomes the environment where internal discipline begins to surface. You stop reacting to the lack of external stimulation and start noticing the presence of internal response. Thoughts become clearer, decisions become less influenced by fear of judgment, and action becomes less fragmented. Loneliness, when stripped of emotional interpretation, becomes pure space for construction. It is not a void, but an unclaimed territory of attention. In this territory, the individual is forced to engage directly with their own structure, without distraction or diffusion. What emerges is not fragility, but unused strength that was never activated because it was always outsourced to external engagement. As this strength becomes visible, loneliness loses its identity as weakness and becomes recognized as the environment where self-reliance quietly begins to form through uninterrupted self-contact and sustained awareness. Identity begins to shift when the need for external definition collapses, and what remains is the raw continuity of self-generated direction. You stop being shaped primarily by reaction to others and begin to form through repetition of internal decisions. This is where the self-made individual emerges, not through declaration, but through consistent alignment between thought and action without reliance on external approval. The mind gradually detaches from inherited definitions of success, worth, and direction, and begins constructing its own internal framework based on lived execution rather than external validation. Each independent decision reinforces a new structure of identity that is not borrowed, but built. Over time, this creates a psychological separation from dependency-based living. You no longer measure progress through comparison, because comparison requires external reference points that no longer hold authority. Instead, progress is measured through internal consistency. This transformation is not dramatic, it is cumulative. Small decisions made without seeking validation accumulate into a stable identity that does not fluctuate with external opinion. The self-made individual is not someone who has removed influence from the world, but someone who has removed dependence on it as a requirement for direction. In this state, identity becomes self-sustaining because it is continuously reinforced through action rather than perception. The result is a grounded sense of existence that is not fragile to external disruption, because its foundation is internal execution rather than borrowed meaning or approval. Inner resilience develops when emotional experience is no longer avoided, but observed without allowing it to interrupt structural behavior. Emotional mastery is not the absence of intensity, but the ability to remain stable while intensity is present. In solitude, emotions rise without external interference, forcing direct confrontation with internal states that were previously bypassed. This confrontation builds resilience not through suppression, but through sustained awareness. The mind learns that emotional fluctuation does not require behavioral collapse. Instead of reacting impulsively to internal pressure, awareness creates space between feeling and action. In that space, choice becomes possible. Over time, this space expands, allowing greater control over response even in difficult conditions. Emotional mastery emerges when reactions stop dictating direction and begin informing it instead. Pain, discomfort, uncertainty, and reflection all become data rather than commands. This shift transforms emotional experience from instability into structured input. Resilience is built through repetition of remaining present under internal pressure without fragmentation. Each instance of stability under emotional weight reinforces the capacity to remain centered in future situations. Eventually, the mind no longer perceives emotional intensity as threat, but as passing state that does not determine identity or outcome. In this condition, resilience is no longer effortful, but integrated. Emotional mastery becomes a quiet form of control where awareness remains intact regardless of internal fluctuation, allowing consistent action even in unstable internal environments. The final state of being unbreakable is reached when external circumstances, internal emotions, and social expectations no longer have the power to fragment direction. In this condition, the individual operates from a fully integrated internal structure where decision-making is consistent, awareness is stable, and action is uninterrupted by doubt or external validation. Being unbreakable does not mean absence of challenge, but absence of internal collapse in response to challenge. Life continues to present uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer disrupts execution. The mind no longer fractures between fear and action because fear has lost authority over movement. Instead, awareness remains anchored in responsibility and continuity of behavior. This creates a state of self-powered existence where energy is generated internally through discipline rather than externally through motivation or approval. At this level, solitude is no longer a condition, it is a foundation. The individual no longer seeks reinforcement from outside systems because internal structure is sufficient to sustain direction. What once felt like isolation now functions as stability. There is no longer dependence on external affirmation to validate progress or worth. Instead, existence is guided by internal coherence between intention and execution. In this final state, the individual becomes unbreakable not because they are untouched by difficulty, but because nothing external can disconnect them from their internal center. They move through life with steady precision, grounded in self-generated authority that does not fluctuate with environment, emotion, or circumstance, but remains consistent through all conditions.